Warning! Warning! This podcast contains spoilers.
Listen at your own risk.
Welcome to Medium Shift, the podcast that investigates how stories stack up from medium to medium through the adaptation process.
In today's episode, we look at why I am so in lesbians with Scott Pilgrim Vs. The World.
Welcome to Medium Shift. I'm Chris.
And I'm Ev.
And this episode, as you have mentioned before, we are concluding Routh-a-thon with a certain person's on this podcast favourite movie that Brad and Ralph has been in, Scott Pilgrim Vs. The World. So without further ado, because I'm sure there's many things you can say about this movie, what do you think of Scott P.V.W.? I don't know, I started to abbreviate it midway through sentence and realised it doesn't quite work. But yeah, what do you think of the movie?
I am a big fan of the movie. I do think it is really something clever. I do consider it probably my favourite film.
It's a very big call.
It is a big call. I wouldn't say it's the best film that I've ever seen, because that's constantly changing.
Sure.
But my favourite, the one I'm constantly going back to as just sitting back and watching, is Scott Pilgrim vs. The World. It is just so clever, so light, humorous, but genre bending as well, and does so much with the medium it is given. It is really, really clever, and I just love Edgar Wright's work.
Yeah, awesome. Do you have like a specific, say, personal connection with the film or something that influenced you when you saw it, or is it literally just a movie you saw that one time that you just really, really loved?
I think it's, that movie I saw one time. I had been recommended it a few times by friends all the way back in high school, and I'm like, saw bits and pieces and eventually got around to seeing it. I'm just like, yeah, I see why everyone kept recommending this to me.
Yep, sure. Right up your alley, basically. Yep. No, entirely fair. Yeah, I mean, I like the film as well. I'm definitely not as strong as it on you as you are, because that would be quite difficult otherwise. Yeah, I know. I think it's good. I think it's really great stylistically. I really enjoy a lot of Edgar Wright's work in general. Honestly, I think this might be one of my lesser favorite of his films. In a lot of ways, we'll definitely get into this when we start talking about the story and the adaptation and whatnot, but a lot of it is really, really great style, framing some less than stellar substance, I think, in a lot of ways. I struggle to connect with the characters or the storyline or the emotional development in a way that I kind of wanted to, and in the kind of the way that I have in other Edgar Wright movies and just other more compelling dramatic movies. So as much as I think it is incredibly stylish, and it's a great adaptation because of that, and it does, as you say, a lot of things with the medium, which I think is really fun and fresh, and it's very funny. It's constantly funny. Yeah, it just doesn't quite have that meat on the bone for me to say I absolutely love this film, even if I can still admire it and still enjoy it every time I see it. Yeah.
I can totally see where you're coming from with that, and I do admit that there is, it's thin plot, and some of the characters, unless you actually rewatch it quite a few times and sort of fill in gaps yourself, you're not going to be able to connect with a lot of these characters, especially Scott Pilgrim himself.
Yep, 100%. It's kind of ironic considering he is literally the titular character that I care about him the least in so many ways. And honestly, think he's generally an asshole and don't really buy his development. But yeah, I mean, all that kind of stuff we'll definitely get into.
So yeah, just to jog people's memory, Scott Pilgrim vs. The World is about Scott Pilgrim fighting the 7 evil ex-boyfriends.
Evil exes.
Of his girlfriend, Ramona Flowers.
I'm pleased with that one. Do we want to start getting into some of the more clever stylistic touches with this film, or should we start with the source material, honestly?
Well, this is an interesting little thing here, because I don't think we can do our normal splitting up the film and the sources and such, because the way it works is so sort of, I feel it's a really good look into adaptation, because it shows how to work with medium specificity really well, and how to work in the sort of adjustment of the source material into something new but the same at the same time. And I think it's hard to talk about one without talking about the other in this particular case.
Sure. I think you make a really good point. I think in a lot of ways it is incredibly faithful in some respects almost to like an obscene level in that not only is it like, well, I mean, look, not incredibly faithful, I guess, in that respect, but I mean, like, a lot of the stylistic and visual touches that you traditionally have from a comic book is brought over from the comic to the film in a way that, you know, other adaptations very, very rarely do. So not only is the movie like a general breakdown of, you know, the same plot as such, but it is also aping the style of the comic book, which is another level of adaptation, which I genuinely haven't really seen that much before, honestly. So
Yeah, it is remarkably impressive, just purely from the fact that it is incredibly difficult to sort of find good equivalents to meet the original medium that an adaptation is adapting, basically. The things you can do with a novel are different to the things you can do with a movie and such. And so for this to find such close-knit ways of copying the style while still keeping it true to the medium it's been adapted into, in this case, the film, it does a really good job of that and does some very clever things that you wouldn't expect a normal film to do.
yeah, absolutely. As we're saying, like, as you mentioned before, this is like genre bending and draws so much from like comic book style and video game style in a very similar way to the source material. So we're kind of skirting around it at this point, but we can definitely talk about the graphic novels briefly for a moment. What was your experience exactly coming into the Scott Pilgrim comics?
So I watched the film first back ages ago, and I didn't really know it was a comic at the time. I then later found out that this was a proper adaptation. I actually thought about it for more than 2 seconds and realized it was adapting something.
Sure.
Because it is pretty obvious in some cases that it is an adaptation, I feel.
Well, it's stylistically reminiscent of the fact that it is an adaptation, certainly, yeah.
Yes. And so I eventually got around, ages and ages later, into finding the first graphic novel. I sat down, I read it again, and basically went, this is something I need to follow up on, and then didn't. And then eventually came back around to reading the first volume for like the third time, and went, all right, that's it. I have money now. I'm buying the rest of these. And I basically bought as many as I could find in the correct order, and just sat down and read them in the span of the first 4 in the span of about a few weeks, and then eventually got round to 5 and 6 when I could find them.
Sure.
It was surprisingly difficult to find.
Yeah, it's this is an interesting thing, and we didn't necessarily touch on this beforehand, but the graphic novels were still in the process of being written when the film came out, which is kind of funny. Correct me if is it volume 5 and 6, or is it just volume 6 that hadn't come out yet?
Well, it's hard to pick timeline-wise, because I know it definitely started production at around volume 4.
Sure.
And whether volume 5 got released before the movie's release or not, it kind of doesn't really matter, because the two were sort of in production at the same time.
Sure, it depends when the writing process started, I guess. Yeah, that's fair.
So in that particular case, yes, it was around about volume 4 that the script started being written.
Sure. Yep. No, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I'm similar to you in the way that I think a lot of people's first experience with this story is the movie itself, and then some people have certainly skirted off to read the comic book as such. It is very much a cult hit, not only the film, but also the comic. The film did horribly when it first started, but it's kind of like grown in status, like people appreciate it and such, until people can describe it not necessarily as a success, but it has enough of a following now they just didn't see it in the cinema to start off with. Comic, by contrast, was actually generally quite successful from when it started off, which is obviously what led it to being adapted into a film. And then it's kind of continued to that to this day. But it is an interesting kind of dichotomy in that so many people know this story basically just as the film per se, as opposed to the comic book. Because even if it is popular, it's still, this is one of those things when we talk about regarding medium success and specificity and such, and that the comic is like always going to be so much of a niche thing than like another big movie starring a ridiculous amount of good actors directed by Edgar Wright. So the pedigree there is just different in some respects. But I do think people who like the movie should definitely give the comics a read. So
oh yes, yeah. I highly recommend giving the read. This is going to sound a bit weird given that I've already said this is my favorite film, but I do feel it is a slight disservice to the original.
Oh, really?
Purely from the fact that there is so much in the comics that you can't get across in a movie in the same way the movie can't, or if you were, say, adapting the movie into a comic, there would be things you can't touch there as well.
Yeah, things just get lost in the transaction.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I do highly recommend anyone who has seen and enjoys the film, definitely go back and find the comics if you can.
Well, do we want to start talking about some of the like broad general changes or anything like that? What are you feeling?
Yeah, we can go through some of the major changes. One of them, probably the biggest one, would probably due to the fact that it was being created at the same time as the film, would be the ending.
Yeah, certainly. So,
which is a novel place to start, but here we are.
A graphic novel place to start. I'm sorry. Yeah. So look, I'm going to preface this with the fact that I haven't actually read all the comics. I've only read the first few volumes. So I'll be coming from this ending from an outsider perspective. But what exactly is the radical difference between the film and comic as such, based on how it ends? Because I know there's some broad similarities, like it's still like the end still occurs in the same place, but the sequence of events leading up to it is a little bit different.
Yes, so it is. Well, there is still the final fight between Gideon and Scott, and Scott and Ramona ending up together and going off to try and be happy.
Sure.
A lot of what sort of leads up to that is very much sort of different and played out in a longer form and relies on stuff that was part of the comics and graphic novels but not part of the film, and so things had to be adjusted to compensate with that.
Sure.
For example, one of the big characters that is actually in and a key vital part of the finale in the graphic novel is Envy Adams, who had a much bigger part in the graphic novels than she did in the film.
Yep, who kind of disappears after the Evil X3, basically. Does she show up after that scene with the vegan boyfriend?
In the film? No,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yeah. That's a pretty radical change, honestly. Interesting.
Yeah, I reckon Envy Adams is probably the biggest change from graphic novel to film.
Sure.
That makes perfect sense, though, because you have restrictions. You only have 90 minutes in a film.
Yeah. Well,
You don't have 6 volumes
Yeah.
of quite large pages.
Yeah, pages, illustrations, all the stuff that graphic novels are made from. But yeah, I mean, obviously that's a great point. Like graphic novels are interesting and you can't cram in quite as much as a novel in such a short period of time, but they can still be narratively much denser compared to other films, when you especially have a lot of graphic novels back to back. So, yeah, I mean, obviously they were always going to lose things in transaction and such. Yeah,
One of the other things they lost in regards to because of time, and I think also because of budgetary restrictions, would be the whole Nega Scott subplot.
Oh yeah, so wait, just enlighten me, because I know that Nega Scott appears at the very end of the movie, but how does that work differently in the graphic novels?
Well, in the graphic novels, it happens before the battle with Gideon. 2, it's actually a lot bigger. There's an actual fight to it instead of just the two of them just
going out to get drinks. We actually have a lot in common.
Yes,
it's a good gag. Yep.
It is a good gag, and it does actually in that line kind of encompass what was sort of part of the moral of that subplot and also the plot in general. And the idea is in the comics, Scott and Nega Scott actually merge together into one being.
Yeah, right.
Because Scott basically works out that, he kind of is a bit of a asshole and needed to change some things about it and needed to actually sort of think back on his past and realize the mistakes he made and transition into a better person.
Sure.
And he does that through a giant super transformation sequence.
As one does.
Yes.
So that's interesting. So I guess the resolution with Nega Scott in the film is similar stylistically. Well, not similar thematically, I think is the better way to describe it, in that it is still like Scott reconciling with the more difficult parts of himself as such, even if they don't have that massive combination. Because I guess Nega Scott is a little bit of a gag that gets tagged on the end in some ways. So what novel does Nega Scott actually appear in the comics?
He first starts popping up around about volume 4.
Okay.
And but doesn't really become a huge factor until 5 and 6.
Sure. Makes sense. Interesting.
Mainly 5.
Yeah. Speaking of which, that's probably a good transition if we want to start talking about some of the main characters and whatnot as well, especially the titular Scott Pilgrim. Yeah. So, I mean, as I kind of touched on at the very beginning of the episode, how even if I think this is stylistically amazing, I think the main storyline and the substance of it is just lacking in some respects. I think the best way to kind of describe it for people who may not be as familiar with the film is that it's essentially like a teenage romance, like comedy, like basically kind of a rom-com teenage drama story. And then it's about Scott Pilgrim growing up to recognize his faults and then realize how he's kind of an arsehole in a lot of ways, and then grow from that. But it is framed in such a way that it is done in the style of a kind of a similar narrative to a video game. I mean, obviously we've talked about this stylistically, but it draws a lot from like arcade games and things like that. And the fact that he has to go through like 7 different levels by fighting the 7 evil X's is kind of a way of framing his personal development through kind of a frame which is similar, which is familiar to people of that ilk, basically. And I think one of the interesting changes, you might feel differently about this actually, but I felt going from comic Scott to film Scott in that they kind of feel like different archetypes in some ways because of the fact that Michael Cera was cast.
Yeah, I do agree with you on that. I think the casting of Michael Cera does quite affect how you see Scott.
Yep, 100%. I think in the comics he reads as more of like a still a bit of a like a nerd character, but a slacker character, like the guy who lounges around, doesn't take any responsibility for his actions, says he's looking for a job but isn't actually looking for a job and such. But in the film, the fact that they cast Michael Cera and some of the more subtle changes, I think, makes the character feel more like a generic, like a geek archetype as opposed to slacker, which people might find interchangeable, but I think there are radical differences about the way that character is perceived. So
yeah, I definitely, again, I see where you're coming from with a lot of things. In this particular case, I do think they kind of hit that key sort of millennial stereotype that I feel encompasses both of them.
Sure, I can see that.
But yes, I also see how I always felt reading the comic version of Scott, he always felt more, confident and sort of
100%.
Even though he was incredibly awkward and anxious-ridden, he sort of kind of knew how to deal with that. Whereas Michael Cera, he's made a career on being very much the socially inept, incredibly awkward without any of the charm of the confidence charm, but instead the sort of quirky charm. And yeah, you're right. That certainly changes how you read the character.
Yeah, for sure. I think my favorite explanation of Michael Cera is that Michael Cera acts like he doesn't actually know he's in a movie and he's just randomly wandered onto set and just is like kind of awkwardly wandering around as people are talking to him. And I think that fairly aptly describes him in a lot of ways. So I think, yeah, it's the cynical side of me thinks that the character was changed to fit kind of the more like classic nerdy gamer archetype, because it like studio executive might have thought it was like, oh yeah, it's geeks who play video games, they should be the ones who will come and watch the film, so therefore we want a character that is more embodiment of them as opposed to this kind of like confident, still socially inept, but like as you say, like much more sure of himself character, which Scott is in the comics. The difficult thing is, even though this is a change, I struggle to think whether it's for the better or not. I think in some ways they're both rather unlikable characters, which is a flaw I think in the comic and in the film. But I think in the film, the fact that Michael Cera is a little less charming than Scott Pilgrim in the comics, that I struggle to connect with him in some ways, in all honesty, especially considering they still kind of, he's been in a number of relationships and such, and he's having a level of success because he's fighting all these people off and things like that, which feels antithetical to the fact that so many people perceive him as a loser. So I think it almost plays up a weird dichotomy in the character, which, I don't know, doesn't necessarily work.
I do agree. There was something key that I sort of thought about while I was reading it, and it sort of had to do with the fact that I related to Film Scott a lot when I was 16. I related to Comic Scott when I was 25.
That's kind of interesting, isn't it?
And yeah, and I think that's kind of where I feel the comic version grounds itself more in that sort of mid-20s reality.
Well, he is 22 in the comic and in the film, but he feels like a teenager in the movie, if I'm being honest. Yeah.
And I feel that sort of the film universe almost sort of appeals more to a sort of slightly younger teenage sort of thing, whereas
for sure, yeah,
the comic version, while it is still very much out there and it's full of the video game references and the weird supernatural, everyone's just fighting each other, it has a subspace whole thing, it still feels very much like day-to-day Gen Y life, which I feel is sort of missed out when you're trying to condense so much into a 90-minute movie.
Sure. Yep, I think that's a really good point. So, I struggle with this a little bit because I generally, not only is Scott Pilgrim somewhat unlikable in some respects, but I'm not really invested in any of the characters. in the film. And I think in the comic, I think you're absolutely right in that since it's depicting that Gen Y lifestyle, I find them more appealing. Generally, I tend to find the versions of the comic characters much more appealing than the film versions, and I think you just hit the nail on the head probably why. I guess that's one of those difficult things. You obviously can't depict the day-to-day life in like a 90-minute film, as you say. But I don't know. Sometimes I really struggle with the fact that I feel like if they cast someone other than Michael Cera, the film could have been much better because you could have had a much more endearing main lead, which therefore would have made me more invested in the story and would have given me a little bit more of that substance that I was looking for. So, yep.
Do you have any?
We'll save that to do it differently.
Okay.
But yes, I have given that a little bit of thought at the very least. So yeah. On top of that as well, see, this is one of the other things I struggle with because generally most of the people in the comic and film are kind of immature. Like Knives Chow as well.
Yep.
The fact that she essentially turns into a creepy stalker after Scott ditches her, but she never gets any kind of moment of self-recognition in the end or anything like that. Is that different in the comics by any chance?
It is in the sense that there's more you can sort of unpack.
Because I guess there's just more time as well. So,
yes.
Yeah.
And also there's a whole little subplot in, I think it's volume 4, in which her father, sort of introduced to her family, and her father tries to kill Scott.
Yeah, right. Okay.
That's the whole thing with his samurai blade, and ends up getting in this sort of 3-way battle along with Roxy. The fourth evil X.
Oh, fun. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Also is quite different to how... That's also one I want to touch on because it's really interesting on how they all sort of condensed a lot of the story really well, I feel, for time's sake.
Sure.
Because the way the whole Roxy thing plays out is quite different in the movie as it is in the film. But yes, I think going back to Knives Chow, while it does sort of flux a bit because there's that time, you can see more from her point of view, and there's a bit more fleshing out. She interacts with Ramona a lot more, like earlier beforehand.
Which I think is much needed, honestly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And with the ending, how that being different, it sort of also plays into a bit with that as well. And also there's a lot of connection with this idea of sort of hero worship when it comes to Knives and Envy.
Oh, yeah, right, okay. Because they only get the one scene in the film as well, don't they? When it's just literally, I love you, and then immediately shuts her up. So, yeah. Yeah, I did wonder about that, because Knives' kind of whole arc didn't feel complete to me in the film in a number of ways. So it's nice to know at least that that's a little bit better in the graphic novel. But yeah, I mean, that doesn't obviously change the film version. One other thing I've been curious about as well is that since the movie was being written at the same time as the 4th volume, is it... Because, as I said, I've read the first couple of volumes of the graphic novel, and in many scenes, especially early scenes, it is almost line for line and shot for shot based on the comic book. Does that change as the series goes on?
Yes and no.
Okay.
A lot of the lines, there are lines that are taken verbatim from the comics, but are in completely different contexts.
Okay.
And because a lot of it is condensed, they sort of throw things around. So that entire battle with Todd, the third evil ex-boy friend,
the vegan psychic.
played by Brandon Routh.
There you go. We haven't actually talked about him. We'll get through the cast. We'll get through the cast. Yes.
But that is actually, they kind of have like these weird sort of 3 mini battles over the course of like a week.
Yeah, right.
Rather than one large one. And in the movie, it basically condenses all 3 down into the one section.
Sure.
Completely missing out on a battle in a mall where they both end up blowing up the entire place and the place ends in a drawer.
Oh, that's disappointing.
Yeah. It was funny. Again, highly recommend go read the graphic novels.
Well, now that I've definitely done this episode and seen the film again, I'm going to borrow the rest from if I can.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome.
But yeah, I think there are things taken quite verbatim, and there are some things that are merged, and I'll bring this back to what I was mentioning with Roxy and how that battle was quite different.
Sure.
A lot of that was actually blended in with sort of the character of Envy Adams from the graphic novel as well.
So Envy shows up in the same battle with Roxy as well? Or?
No. There's an actual earlier battle between Envy Adams and Ramona Flowers in the novel, which starts a lot like the initial fight between Roxy and Ramona in the film.
Okay.
And it brings out Ramona's giant hammer with +2 against girls. And it brings in the idea of Roxy's weak point being the back of her knee.
Mm-hmm.
That is Envy Adams' weak point and something that Scott can actually manage to get ahead of.
Yeah, right.
The part where Scott has to fight Roxy with Ramona basically guiding his fists, that comes from the comic that came out on Free Comic Day between Volume 3 and 4.
Oh, right.
With another unrelated thrown in ninja character that was just brought in for that one shot.
Sure, why not?
But that was all set up there, basically. So yeah, they basically condensed 3 characters into the one for that one fight sequence, which I think worked really well in comparison to what I've seen other adaptations do in regards to their compressing.
Sure,
it got the best of everything.
Yeah, it sounds really economical, honestly, the way you're describing it, which I think is kind of good. Like, it is difficult to have like 7 main well, not necessarily main antagonists, but 7 like series of antagonists in films, because that structure generally doesn't quite work that way. But they've structured it almost like a video game, funnily enough, where it's one level after the next in like kind of a syncopated rhythm. I even remember reading in an interview with Edgar Wright that he approached the battles as basically the equivalent of musicals. So that every time, they break out in fighting, it's the equivalent of in a musical breaking out in dance. And I think that pace is really intentional, and I think really works for the film too. So
that leads back to what we were talking about with medium specificity. I think that's really well done, because there was nothing like that in the comics, because comics, you can read them at your own pace. You can't do anything with that. Whereas film, they can very much go with a visual and tonal and musical pace that you can keep up with, that keeps things really interesting.
Sure.
And I think actually leads itself more into the video game aesthetic in the film than it does in the actual graphic novel itself. One, they can do more visual stuff with it. 2, they can keep up the very rhythm that a lot of these fighting games require. If anyone's played things like Street Fighter or Streets of Rage or Mortal Kombat, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's very, very reminiscent of that.
Yes. So I think that's one of the points where it actually works better in the film's favor than in the graphic novel, which is kind of what you need in adaptation. You need that distinctiveness on its own to keep things going.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's kind of interesting, honestly. Like, one of the things we've kind of touched on too, but a lot of the stylistic touches in the graphic novel, like, say, when you see Scott Pilgrim's like room and it says like, this is his, this is not his, and so on and so forth. Like, stuff like that is common and frequent in comic books, because that kind of, that type of visual medium where you can take your time and do like big splash pages and whatnot allows you a level of flexibility in the way you tell a story. But that's generally not the way it's told in film. So even if it is almost exactly the same style to the graphic novel, the fact that it is in a film is radical onto itself. And I think really works in distinguishing it. So yeah, that is what this movie is known for more than anything. It's kind of video game style and aesthetic and those fights and such, even more than the story and anything like that. So I think you're absolutely right.
There's this great example that I always love bringing up, and it's to do with the idea of transitions. And if you want to go into more of this, Every Frame of Painting does a really good sort of video essay on Edgar Wright and visual comedy.
Sure, I've seen it. Rest in peace. Every Frame of Painting, not Edgar Wright. He's still alive.
Yes.
Yep.
And I'm sure Tony is probably.
I know, but he's not making the channel.
Well.
The channel stopped.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yep.
But there's one particular shot that I absolutely love, and it's transitions. It's in the fight with Todd, and where he basically throws Scott through the wall into the outside, but it's set up very much like a comic panel, and so you get a sort of movement across, and it transitions into that scene outside.
Sure.
And I think stuff like that is really clever, and the very dynamic sort of very comic book-esque splash words across it, but with their added movements, feel more impactful than they would.
Feel dynamic.
Yeah,
honestly.
absolutely.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously a comic book is static on a page, so you use like different styles and techniques to make it feel like things are moving and whatnot. But in a film, you can just show it moving.
Yeah.
And that's what those kind of words kind of do. So yeah, as you're talking about, like it's a really smart and faithful adaptation of the style of the comics, which feels even more impressive in a film setting, I think. So yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about regarding the movie? Or we can actually go through the cast quickly if you want, because it's got a crazy big and good cast for the film.
Yeah.
So like there are so many name actors in here, which is really impressive. So, I mean, Brandon Routh is always good. He's basically playing a bit part. Like, it's him and Chris Evans. It's a crossover with their first Evans Fest as well.
Hey!
That's fun. Both of them are kind of playing, like, silly caricatures, like comedic roles, basically. But I think they both do a really good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They know which parts to highlight and ham up.
They know exactly what kind of movie they're in and what people expect from their characters, especially Chris Evans.
Oh, yes.
I can't get over his facial hair. It's just so perfect. Oh, I love it. Yep.
Yes. But yeah, no. Also another podcast favorite, Brie Larson.
Oh, yes. Love Brie Larson. We're going to have to do a sequence in her festival thing, which we'll base a pun on the title or whatever else, but I'd be definitely on board with doing that. She's great.
I feel at this point that'd just be us throwing all these other episodes we've already made and just going, listen to those again.
That's true, actually. We could almost make it retroactively. But yeah. No, Brie Larson's fantastic. Even if she does have a smaller role in this one, I was kind of expecting, honestly. But as we've talked about, Envy is like much more diminished for the film.
Anna Kendrick's in there.
Anna Kendrick's
Audrey
really
Plaza. Kieran Culkin. Mary Elizabeth Winstead.
Who I really like as an actress. For people who haven't seen See 10 Cloverfield Lane, we haven't actually talked about Ramona Flowers much too far. I think she's a bit of a problematic character in some... Like, she's almost like the archetypal pixie dream girl in some respects. But I think they tone it down a little bit for the film, which I appreciated.
I do, and I don't think it goes all the way to Manic Pixie Dream Girl
Maybe
because
not quite so far.
she has a lot of her own issues as well.
Yeah, she has her own... Well, not necessarily... Well, she kind of has her own arc in the film, even if it's a little diminished. But yeah.
And it isn't always about, especially as the ending shows, it's not always about the power of love and all about being focused on Michael Cera's character, Scott Pilgrim.
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that sort of sets it apart. But again, graphic novel, because it has that time and because it can do so much, I do think she's a lot better in that.
Sure. Yep. No, it's fair enough.
Yes.
But Mary Elizabeth Winstead still great though. I still think she delivers a good performance. I mean, I think Michael Cera delivers a good performance as well. I think he's just a little miscast, if anything. So yeah.
And I'm very excited for Birds of Prey.
Yes. Yep. It's gonna be great.
Isn't it? Yes. Ooh, also Alison Pill, who plays Kim.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I do love her as an actress as well. If you see her in the newsroom, she does a fantastic job there.
Oh, okay, sure.
The Aaron Sorkin show.
Yeah, she is fantastically deadpan, which this movie is so funny in a way that the graphic novel is funny as well. Like, it definitely has a lot of jokes and such, but it really feels like, so this is something we can talk about in regards to Edgar Wright's larger filmography, but Edgar Wright has always been so amazing at visual comedy.
Yeah.
Like, so much of a contemporary, particularly American comedy films are reliant on just pure dialogue, basically. Dialogue and performance. But Edgar Wright has always been so fantastic with using transitions and sound effects and just the medium of film and visual design in really specific ways to make you laugh. And this movie is no exception. So if for people who haven't seen these other movies, like, I'd recommend all of the Cornetto trilogy, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, The World's End, all great. Baby Driver's really good too. This is a really interesting precursor to Baby Driver in a lot of ways, in that Baby Driver is an action musical, basically, when he sets its action sequences to music, and this kind of alludes to that implicitly through the fact that the fights are staged kind of as dancing or musicals, basically. So.
And music and rhythm does play such a huge part in this movie as well.
Yeah.
I mean, that sequence with Clash at Demon Head, and it starts playing and everything is hit to the beat of the song that's diegetically playing in the movie. I thought that was really clever, and it also, again, alludes to the comic book nature with everything being panelled up, but still fitting the visual style and the cinematic medium specific. The best bits of using film.
Sure. Yeah. The pure cinema.
Yes.
Well, sorry, I need to say it with a fancier accent. Pure cinema. There we go.
Thank you, Hitchcock.
It did sound a bit like Hitchcock, isn't it? Great, cool. I mean, is there anything else you want to touch on in relation to the film or comic? It sounds like we enjoyed both of them quite a bit, despite some reservations for the most part. I am very interested in finishing the graphic novel, that's for sure.
Yes, so, highly recommend, and I highly recommend to all of you out there, go read it.
Banger?
Yeah, and again, it is always interesting looking at something that has sort of been created at the same time as it's an adaptation being created at the same time as a serial narrative.
Yeah, for sure. Because this almost certainly influenced the way that the last couple of volumes were written, basically. Like, it has to. Like, it's inevitable in some ways. So, yeah.
And vice versa. And, like, some of the aspects, I talked about how they shifted time. A lot of that final fight also is sort of coming back from the volume 3 they'd previously worked on, and so that had sort of shifted. And in a way, I feel that actually also it found a way to make itself different enough while still being very much transformative in a sense. Like the entire bit with the band dressed in black and white, yelling, "We are Sex Bomb and we're here to make you think about death and be sad and stuff." That comes in like a lot earlier, but I feel works so much better in the final shot in the film than it would have in the movie. So I think it really does, it can, because there's this, as Dr. Liam Burke describes, fidelity flux. But yes, this fidelity flux really gets sort of interesting changes that I think improve both the source and the film for the better.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm sure fidelity flux will be something that we talk about in quite a number of episodes, because it is very frequent, especially when it comes to big franchises these days.
We already have talked about it in our Arrow podcast.
Yeah,
episode,
true. That's a
where
very
I
good
called
point.
it Something Us Entirely.
Well, sure. But, you know, retroactively fidelity flux.
Yes.
We'll try and use that term from now on. But awesome.
Alliterative.
It is. I do like alliteration. Speaking of alliteration...
Almost as much as puns.
Yeah, it's true. Speaking of alliteration, shall we move it into Do It Differently?
All right. Jingle, jingle, jingle. Does it count as alliteration if it's just the same word 3 times?
No. Do it differently. D.
Ah.
Yeah. That's what I was
Okay.
referring to. Come on.
I'm sorry.
Do you want to go first, or shall I?
Yeah, I'll go first. I'll knock this out pretty quickly.
Because you wouldn't change much.
Well, no, there's actually something I would change. Like, I'd leave the film as it is, but then I'd make a new adaptation.
Okay.
Like, modern, now that we've got that well in the past. We've got both of those now as source materials for a TV series.
Oh, yeah, nice. Miniseries or full TV series?
I think you get a solid full season
Okay.
out of the full arc.
Like
I think
full
that's
24 episodes, or...
yes,
Wow,
but like
okay.
just the one season.
Sure, yeah.
Everything comes to a head and the end, which kind of sucks as a, or maybe like multiple seasons, but of like 6 to 12 episodes each.
Yeah, sure. Like miniature seasons, but still break it out like so.
Yes.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, so I would do something like that because we're in a time of very interesting web series streaming platforms, prestige TV.
TV is changing drastically and
Yes.
becoming far more prestigious and just interesting artistically, certainly. Yeah.
And so I think you can really do some stuff that probably is more, I guess, faithful. Well, I hate actually saying that word. I do think in this particular case it does work because there is so much in the graphic novel that I'd love to see play out. And it almost feels like it could just be sort of like a day-to-day life kind of thing. You can extend it, add in the extra bits that were not there before, and still have those big sort of fights as season enders, I guess, if we're going with the sort of mini season across multiple seasons. Yes. Too many S's.
More alliteration.
Yes. Why do we rely on alliteration and puns?
Because we have nothing. We have nothing else to fall back on. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I'd basically give it to some of the new up-and-comers that you sort of see. I really want to see a new perspective on this and someone... So I don't have anyone in particular. I just want to see if I had to pick, basically I'd go with get someone like Taika Waititi and tell him to go find a team.
I could see
and then
that.
let that team go on and take it off.
Yep.
Whoever he thinks is best while he's off making amazing satires and Marvel movies.
Sure, he can be an executive producer,
Yes.
basically. Yeah, I could see that. Yep.
So yeah, that is effectively the main change I want to make. I agree, we need to cast someone other than Michael Cera, mostly now because Michael Cera is too old to play
That is true.
Genway. So I think, again, this be a great vehicle for some new up-and-coming talent, or possibly get a few big names in there, maybe someone like Tom Holland.
God
might
damn
work.
it. That is exactly who I was going to recommend to play Scott Pilgrim. You stole it from me. That was my do it differently.
Oh, okay.
When you started going on the tangent, it's like, oh, it could be some new big names, or like, you know, it's like people we already recognize or something. It's like, don't say Tom Holland. Don't say Tom Holland. He's just going to take it from me. God damn it. I
apologize,
I
but-
might as well just blend my do it differently with you then.
Go for it.
We'll do it as a mini-series and then cast Tom Holland as Scott Pilgrim, because I think that works brilliant, and that he is, I think, more endearing but can still do that kind of slacker, awkward responsibility esque kind of thing. I'm sorry, but it works.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think he would be fantastic, and I think you are absolutely right. I was considering recommending either a mini series or just a longer format for for another adaptation, while still having Edgar Wright's thing still be its own thing. Because I think the fact that Edgar Wright is so visually oriented and he's so stylistically strong, you still need someone at that fore. So even if Edgar Wright wanted to come back and also wanted to either showrun or still wanted to be involved, I think that would be really great. But yeah, no, absolutely. Recast Tom Holland, I think he would be so good. He's so charming.
Well, if we're going to recast for this new adaptation TV series of the present,
Yeah.
who would you think for someone like Ramona Flowers?
I've given it some thought. I don't know. It's a little bit difficult because Tom Holland implicitly, even though he's like the same age, like he's mid to late 20s or something like that, he feels like a teenager as well in a weird respect. So I would almost want to go for someone who seems a little bit younger for Ramona Flowers.
Oh, yeah?
Look, my first instinct, honestly, was someone like, say, there was a really great actress in a film I saw recently, but now I've completely forgotten what she's called. Have you seen the film Me and Earl and the Dying Girl?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, it's really good. I actually watched that just the other night. But the girl who plays the dying girl in that movie, whose name I completely do not remember right now, I think she would probably be fantastic. She might be, I guess Me and Earl was a few years ago now, but I still feel like she would be young enough that it would be pretty effective as well. So
Okay.
yep. Were you thinking of anyone in particular?
Well, I sort of kind of took things in a bit of a different direction. I sort of teenagery TV actor.
Sure.
But I was going along the lines of someone like Vanessa Morgan.
Vanessa Morgan.
She's currently in Riverdale.
I haven't seen it.
Neither have I, actually.
Oh, okay.
I've seen her in other works that she's done.
Sure. Olivia Cook, that's her name.
Ah, yes.
Yep.
So, yes. Any other people we can think of?
No.
Steven Stiles, Kim?
Not especially. I really just want to see Tom Holland, in all honesty.
Yeah,
Most
that's
of the
fine.
other people I think are really well cast.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, Michael Cera was probably the only one I took issue with. The only other thing I could think of was Brie Larson, but not because she was bad, but because I thought she was underserved.
Yeah.
I love Brie Larson, so I just wanted to see her in more of the film, honestly. Yeah, I mean, outside of that, I think the rest of them are still pretty spot on.
Yeah, looking at the film and the page at the same time, they did spot on with costume, with actor choice, with the way they present it. It was fantastic. Almost feels like it could have been literally taken from page to screen.
He said the thing, everyone. Page to screen. Yeah, no, very good.
Just from the fact that they look so much like their illustrated characters.
Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously the comic characters are still very stylistic in comparison, but you can, like, they nail the features, the
Yes.
distinguishing features for each character. So, as we said, this is a very faithful adaptation in a lot of really solid and smart ways. So, yeah, I think the problems I have with the movie are just kind of carried over from the comic book in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So, awesome. Do we want to move into recommendations then?
Sure.
Yep.
Have you got something you would like to recommend?
I do. So, in a little change of pace for me, because I normally don't do this, but I'm going to recommend something related to Scott Pilgrim vs. The World.
Ooh.
In that I am actually going to recommend Scott Pilgrim vs. The World, the movie, the game, the soundtrack.
Okay.
So people who are familiar with Scott Pilgrim, I'm sure you'd be aware that there was a side-scrolling beat-em-up game released based on the film at the same time with the visual style of the comic book, which I think is really fun. I haven't played a whole lot of it as such, but the soundtrack to it is amazing, and I have listened to for years. It's by, I think it's a Japanese, like, pixel pop band, I think is the term. It's really not my area of expertise. I think they're called Amaguchi, but it's basically like these really contemporary poppy remixes of like 8-bit and 16-bit sounding music to the point that it is just really, really cool and sets a great tone that is perfect not only for the video game but also just Scott Pilgrim as a franchise. It fits really well, and I've listened to this score for years. It's just it's really fun, and I've never recommended a score before, so I figured why not, because this is really appropriate, and for people who enjoy the game or just video game music in general, I think this is definitely worth listening to. Yeah,
we didn't actually touch much on the Scott Pilgrim franchise.
No, well, I mean, the film and the comic is the main thing per se. Like, the video game just doesn't, I think, add a lot to it, I guess, outside of just, like, maybe strengthening those video game roots into literally making it a side-scrolling beat-em-up, so, yeah.
But there was a lot of Scott Pilgrim-related paraphernalia that's come out and around that I just found really interesting. And how each sort of can sort of add a little bit, not a whole lot, but sort of changes the way you see things.
Sure. I mean, it is still like a media franchise in that respect, obviously. Very much a cult media franchise, but hey, still popular. So, yeah, this movie did really poorly when it came out, but I mean, everyone seems to know about it now, so yeah.
And even the comics are pretty big in the comic fandom, the comic world.
Yep, the comic...
Always really have been, I feel.
Yeah, exactly. The comic zeitgeist.
Yes.
Cool. Oh, so what are you going to be recommending for us?
So I'm going to continue with the theme of recommending things Brandon Routh has been in for Routh-a-thon. And to stick with the theme of Scott Pilgrim, in a way, I'm recommending a video game.
Oh, yeah, nice.
So I'm recommending Lego DC Supervillains.
He voices the Atom in that, doesn't he? Have I got that right?
Yes, he also voices Shazam.
Oh, awesome.
And Billy Batson.
Yeah, cool. Yep.
Yes. But really, I can just say the Lego games in general are always a delight to play.
Really charming.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And like with Edgar Wright, very visual in its humor, especially in the early ones. Yes, especially go back and if you can play the original PlayStation 2 Lego Star Wars games.
Oh, yeah.
Because they are a masterclass on how you can make things funny without any dialogue at all.
Yep. It's kind of like almost classic slapstick, but just ham-fisted, shoved into Star Wars into the best way possible. Lego games have always been really good at that in like really kind of comedic gags. And yeah, I think my experience with those new games are absolutely the same. Yeah.
Even though they have introduced voice work in them, I do think, they are really great still at the whole blending of different types of humors all together and making everything just a delightful little experience that you can jump in and out of as you so wish.
Yeah, and really great co-op experience as well.
Yes.
So, yep, I always enjoy that. So,
and visually very appealing.
Oh, yeah.
Because everything is Lego.
Everything is Lego. I mean, do we all not want to live in a world that is just made of Lego? So, yeah.
I don't know. I walk around in bare feet a lot.
That's a very good point. God, I can't imagine how painful feet would be in that universe. Yeah, no, I would definitely second that recommendation. I even think the Lego and Marvel stuff, like Lego Marvel Superheroes 1 and 2, are really good fun as well. So, yeah, just anyone who is lightly familiar with those franchises, who wants to kind of see that in a video game setting and wants to play along with someone else, like this is great for younger people or even just a bit of a party game. So, yeah, the Lego games are always super charming. Yep, absolutely. Cool. Oh, well, thank you to everyone who listened to the final episode of Routh-a-thon. We can be found at mediumshift@gmail.com. Feel free to send in recommendations or even recommendations for puns for other actors and or directors that we're going to be looking at in the near future. Next episode, we're not going to be going into Routh-a-thon and instead going to stick with the musical theme, but this time make it a little bit more morally ambiguous.
We're doing The Greatest Showman.
Yep.
This is the greatest show.
Whoa.
I mean,
it's not. But...
No, this podcast really is not that great.
Nor the film, but we'll get into that next episode. So until next time, fare thee well.
Brandon Routh.